Welcome back, everyone, to our afternoon panel discussion on the professionalization of peer support, the good, the bad, and the other. This morning, we heard about the organic development of peer support through the disability rights movement and here at home in Maryland. And we heard so many folks on screen and in the chat talk about how they wish there had been more peer support available when they were dealing with crises or challenges. We're really lucky in Maryland because we not only have such a strong network of independent peer-run centers and programs, but we also have a growing number of peers who are working in clinical and treatment settings where folks experiencing a challenge or a crisis for the first time might be able to meet and see a peer and get support in that moment, whether that's in an emergency room, in an outpatient program, or on a mobile response team. So our last session of the day is focused on what peer support looks like in a professional context and what we should all be thinking about when it comes to the professionalization of peer support and how that continues to expand. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. Diane, Carlos, and Brendan. Hello, hello, welcome, welcome.
Hey, Katie, good to see you.
Hey, Katie.
Hello, welcome. Thank you all so much for being part of this panel today. I'm really, really excited about our discussion. Let's start with introductions. Would you please each let us all know who you are, where you are, and what you're doing when it comes to peer support?
Ladies
Who
first.
wants to start? Go for it. Thank you.
Diane.
Oh, Carlos, I thought you were going first. Sorry.
Oh.
I am Diane Lane. I work as the executive director of Chesapeake Voyagers over on the Eastern Shore. We are a nonprofit peer support wellness and recovery center. We cover the 5 midshore counties of Dorchester, Caroline, Talbot, Queen Anne's, and Kent. But we're located in Talbot County in Easton.
Carlos, buddy, go ahead.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carlos Hardy. I'm the program director for Dee's Place Wellness and Recovery Center, located in East Baltimore, right in the footprint of Johns Hopkins Medical Center. As a matter of fact, we're loosely affiliated with Hopkins. So we do peer recovery support services. I have a staff of 3. I have a couple of volunteers that are doing peer work. We host 24 12-step meetings a week. We have acupuncture, we have peer services. Our monthly census is about 4,500 folks that cross our threshold.
And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brendan Welsh, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. What that means for me is I've not found it necessary to pick up a drink in a little over 11 years now. And as a result of that recovery, a direct result of that recovery, I have the honor and privilege of serving as Maryland's Director of Community-Based Access and Support for Maryland's Behavioral Health Administration. And really all that means in a nutshell is I have the distinct pleasure of working with a great team that oversees a large portfolio of state-funded peer-run programs and peer-run services across Maryland. I'm really grateful to be here today.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm Katie Rouse. I'm the Executive Director of Honor and of Maryland, and it's a joy to be with you all on the screen today. Thank you. So first things first, we're here to talk about the professionalization of peer support, but let's talk first just about what is peer support? What is the fundamental difference between being a peer support specialist or a peer supporter and other types of helping roles? And that's open for anyone to answer.
I'll take a first stab at it. So I identified peers or certified peers or recovery coaches as part of the helping profession, if you will, or helping professions. And so we have criminal justice, we have human services, nursing, psychology, community health workers. I think the difference between peers and some of the other helping professionals is that the other helping professions are primarily academic driven or academia driven, meaning that you go to school oftentimes for multiple years, you pass the courses, you get a certification, you get licensure, and then you work in that particular field. We as peers are new to the helping profession, if you will, constantly or currently being defined. We do have some classroom training. I think it's like 46 hours, but basically that's it. And in some cases, once you take the initial CCAR or wellness and recovery action planning training, programs will hire you then while they're waiting for you to complete the other domain. So I think it's just the academic and the classroom dynamic is what defines the two groups.
Yeah. And then just to kind of piggyback off of what Carlos was saying, and to provide the alternative, it's the lived experience for me. We have, talking about this from the professionalism standpoint, in the Department of Health, well before my time in this role, there was large conversations around the difference between a community health outreach worker and a peer recovery specialist, and why couldn't peers just work as community health outreach workers? And really, peers can work as community health outreach workers, but not necessarily all community health outreach workers can work as peers. And it's because of that lived experience piece that really differentiates us between whether it's a community health outreach worker, a psychiatrist with only the clinical and education parts that Carlos had mentioned, because as we know, some psychologists may be peers also, but it's really at the core of who we are. It's our lived experience. It's the walk we've walked. It's the places we've been and the things we've gone through that really, I think, separate us out.
Well, you know what? It's interesting. Go ahead, Diane.
No, I was just gonna say, I agree completely. I mean, to me, it's the lived experience.
You know, I thought about that early today. I had the fortunate opportunity to tune in when the conference kicked off this morning and Dr. Fisher was on. And I mean, he literally had my jaw in my lap with a lot of the things he was talking about. And one of the things, Brendan, is, you know, we have peers are modeled or driven by experience, but it needs to be, I'm thinking that it probably, especially when we talk in terms of professionalism, it needs to be a little bit more than experience, because you can have experiential knowledge of being a person in recovery. And it's really interesting because I think as we get further along in this, it talks about criteria like 2 years. I remember when we were first developing this peer training, we got strong pushback from folks that were saying it shouldn't be, why 2 years? Why not a year? I've had a peer that has 4 months clean. He's in a recovery house now, and he's done the CCAR training. He wants to volunteer over here. So there's the experiential knowledge, and then there's the knowledge of working as or functioning as a peer. And I think I don't want to minimize that, right. You know? I think it's important. That's, in other words.
I hear that very much. I also, when I was, and for everyone on the event page for Eventbrite, you can click on the link to read bios for all of our speakers. And Diane, I think I remember in your bio that you were really talking about sort of the non-hierarchical nature, the mutuality of peer support. And so I wondered if you would speak on that for a minute as it relates to what differentiates peer support from other helping professions.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's very important for me as far as how we run things here. That was one of the biggest things I learned from the very beginning, especially in the IPS training that I received early on in 2010, that you have to, in order for it to stay peer support where you're mutual with that other person, there's a connection, you make sure you stay on the same page, you stay at that ground level, so that you don't start to think that you're above the other people that you're serving, or that you're above and have too much power and control over others, because at the end of the day, we're all people, we've all had difficulties, and we need to keep that in mind at all times so that we can remember who we are and how we got to where we are. And so having that non-hierarchical approach is how you can do that. Not easy to do necessarily, especially when you're supposed to be the leader of an organization or the leader at the state level, like Brendan is. So it's difficult because sometimes you have to make sure you put on that leadership hat and put your foot down about certain things. But it's always good to be able to say, you know what, I am no different than all the other people that walk in this door. I walk the same way they do. I breathe the same way they do, and I can relate to them at some level. I might not look like them, but I know there's a place in that person that I can relate to within myself. So that's very important to me.
That's beautiful. And bridging together that idea of having mutuality, but also appreciating diversity and difference. And Carlos, I want to echo something that you said earlier. Because of the work of peer advocates in so many different communities, like we have a very rich tapestry of trainings and experiences and learning cohorts that have happened in Maryland in different communities, whether you're talking about going through CCARF or Recovery Coach Academy or RAP and Wellness Recovery Action Planning or ECPR, like Dan Fisher talked about this morning, or intentional peer support, like you just mentioned, Diane. Can I ask, you've all been in this world for a while. When you were starting out in peer support, how much of your own knowledge about what peer support is and how it fit into this context, how much of that came through formal training? Or what parts did you have to just learn through experience or mentorship or kind of feeling your way through? Because I think there are a lot of different pathways that people have come into this. So for you, if you think back to your early days, what was training, what was formal, what was informal and experiential?
I'll start by speaking to that. For me, I actually started before this job doing peer support as a family navigator. So, and I kind of fell into that because I was trying to find help for my son who has a form of autism. And because I was able to navigate the system for him, I had people pick up on the fact that I was then kind of training or helping other people, even teachers, to understand my son. And so that was something that they said, maybe you would be good at this kind of job. So I did that for a couple of years before I came to Chesapeake Voyagers and got this up and running. But so that was that lived experience that really drove me to be able to do the job that I was doing prior to this one. Once I got here in doing the adult peer support work, pulling on my own, it's one thing for me to be a mom and to tap into being the parent of a child who has the problem. And then it's different when it's like, okay, I am tapping into all the stuff that I've been through, the abuse, trauma, depression, things that I've lived through myself. And so tapping into all of those things and then being able to relive some of those things by connecting with other people, that is the richest thing that I experienced from the beginning, that I brought to the table. I will say that definitely there are trainings that I went to that have really enriched my way of viewing things and being able to look at peer support from a different perspective, per se. The most important training I ever had was the intentional peer support. It really helped me open my eyes to see that I don't necessarily have to only be able to connect with somebody that has had the same diagnoses or the same situations. There's somebody that I grew up different than them. I've experienced different things than them, but I can still connect with that person. I can still see something within us. And also that person can help me also, that they can actually help me grow and learn. That's another thing about peer support that's very, very unique, is that we're not always necessarily the ones giving. We can also receive and learn from what we receive from the other person. So that's the mutuality as well there. And then there's, things that I've learned along the way, like RAP, that gives you, the tools that you can use for not only for yourself, but also for those that you're, doing peer support with. But I think also the biggest thing is you got to look at it for yourself, because you have to keep in mind that you are the one that is in recovery and that you have overcome these things. You have to keep that in mind first, or you might lose perspective of why you are doing what you're doing. So thank you for letting me speak.
Brandon?
Excuse me. So ironically, I was a little bit of the opposite of Diane. My approach to peer support when I first got in to the health department that I started my peer work in was very much reflective of my personal lived experience and recovery style. It was extremely, this is the way you do it. If it was mental health issues that I was dealing with, I went to my therapist to deal with those. And if it was my substance use recovery issues I was dealing with, I took care of that through my 12-step mutual support meetings. That's the way it worked. That's the way it should work for everybody. And then I realized after probably the second or third encounter that I had with people I was working with, that wasn't very welcomed by those individuals. And it was around the same time that I was introduced to CCAR's Recovery Coach Academy. And I think similar to the experience that Diane explained with IPS, it really blew my mind and changed my world. I learned about, I get choked up when I talk about this because I learned about multiple pathways of recovery and meeting people where they were, and that we are in recovery when we say we're in recovery. And it was like, wow, it's not just one way anymore. It's like really letting the person describe what their world should look like when they're well and helping them to get along to that journey. And that's why, for me, we talk about professionalization, and some people get scared, and it's not scary for me. It's about learning new skills and taking the time to get outside of your comfort zone and what you know, just to be a little bit more well-rounded and a little bit more well-read in your ability to help other people that are like you, that may have similar experiences, but not the same experiences. And so for me, training was a huge part of my process in becoming what I consider a good peer recovery specialist, so that I was actually able to help people get to their recovery, get to their wellness, and not necessarily my vision of wellness or recovery for them. Because as well-intentioned as I was, it wasn't the right way of doing. So yeah, no, I had my experience. My experience definitely worked for me. That's what got me to being a peer. But I think it's the training and learning from other people's experiences, whether it's my colleagues or the people that I'm supporting, like Diane talked about, that really have better prepared me to work as a peer long-term. So thank you.
So in my case, I probably describing it chronologically is the best way to do it. And it's a combination of mentorship and training. So I'm a person in long-term recovery since September 23rd, 1993. My first 8 years in this process, I ran a pretty large supportive housing program that served men, women, custodial parents, veterans, seniors. Around the 7th or 8th year was when I first started hearing these rumors or bubblings up about recovery, or this recovery community. We had the Minnesota Summit in 2001, where you had 150 people in recovery from 30 states come together in Minnesota to start talking about, you know, why doesn't recovery have a voice? Why doesn't recovery have a seat at the table? Dr. Fisher said it so eloquently today. We are typically systematically not invited. But in this particular case, the feds started inviting us to the table. Out of the Minnesota Summit, Faces and Voices was founded. Out of Faces and Voices, we had the Peter Hart opinion poll. I'm not sure how many people remember Peter Hart. And that's where we first started having this dialogue or conversation around recovery and what was recovery, or board that, a definition of recovery. It's interesting because Hart's poll, basically people outside of recovery thought recovery meant that people were struggling with drugs and fighting drugs. And this was perpetual battle. Not that there's life after drugs and we're going to achieve a lot of great things. But it was also this work that I was doing was my first time doing little A advocacy, Brendan. Even before I knew what it was, I served 5 years as a drug treatment organizer working on NIMBY and banana issues. And then I had the opportunity to big A advocacy because I was executive director for NCADD for a couple of years. So spent a lot of time in Annapolis. But it was also about that time that I met the organized recovery movement and became a member of that community. You know, we had Faces and Voices of Recovery. We were doing conferences. I was able to take a team up to Philadelphia and meet Arthur Evans. And Arthur cut his teeth from Tom Kirk in Connecticut. And Tom and CCAR were really the impetus for forming the Recovery Coach Academy. You know, so it was a case of that. I went to work for Baltimore Substance Abuse Systems, BSAS, which is now Behavioral Systems Baltimore. And in 2010, I had the opportunity to convince the president at the time that we needed to get involved in peer services and recovery coaches. And so I was able to get the funding to take a team up to Connecticut. And we took the CCAR training, we took the TOT to train the trainer, and we came back and we started the Baltimore Recovery Course. So those were the first trainings for peers in the state of Maryland. We trained the first 250 peers in 20-person cohorts, and then we embedded them in programs, Brendan, and we paid them a stipend. I'm promoting. If you're gonna, you need to pay them a stipend. So I left BSAS in like 2012, and I got a contract with the state to inspect and certify recovery houses. But they also hired us to develop the domains, 3 of the 4 domains that make up the certification for the peer certification now. So my staff and I developed the wellness and recovery, the mentoring and education, and the advocacy domains. We beta tested them across the state, and then we turned the curriculums over to the state. And so that was my engagement, my motivation. This movement, if you will, has grown way beyond what we envisioned back in 2012. And so I'm happy because it's given people in recovery, oftentimes with huge gaps in their employment, opportunities to be employed and to do something that they're passionate about. Yeah, but it has a caveat, and I'm quite sure we'll get to that further down the line.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you all so much. You know, in listening to your like very different pathways into peer support as a personal experience, as a, you know, relationship based, and then also into professional career, it makes me think about how many discussions there were between peer leaders when Maryland's certification process was being developed about, you know, what are the domains, how many hours, what are the requirements, how are we gonna like do this in a way that is congruent with the values and principles of peer support, and also recognizing that this is an intersection between sort of a peer world and a professional world. So once and especially that kind of mental health peer support communities and substance use recovery peer support communities may have had very different experiences along the way, just different trainings, different kind of structures and pathways. So nowadays, right, the CPRS has been recognized since 2013, and it has this sort of choose your own adventure structure to it, right? As long as you have your core class, your 46 hours total in the 4 domains, 25 supervision hours, 500 service hours, 2 years of sustained recovery, an application and an exam, you can have lots of folks with CPRS after their name who may share a lot of experiences, but also may have taken very different classes, like satisfied those requirements in different ways. Do you think that the process we have now makes it easier or harder to start a career in peer support, and why or how?
I'll jump on that one first. And I have to kind of echo what Rowan just put in the chat box. That is the most concise description of the certification process in Maryland I've ever heard in my life. And I normally have to ramble it off on at least a weekly basis. So kudos to you on that. To your question about, has the certification process made it easier or harder to start a career in Maryland as a peer? I think it is intentionally set up in a way that it is going to make it inherently slightly harder to start a career as a certified peer recovery specialist in Maryland. There are requirements that you just articulated very well that are put in place that elevate the professional status of an individual with that credential. And in order to obtain that, you have to go through and meet the training requirements, the experiential requirements. Now, all that to say, I don't think it's fair that we would put a certification requirement to start a career as a peer. For example, the opportunity that On Our Own of Maryland offers through its network of wellness and recovery centers allows peers to work without that credential at this time. We do encourage them to be credentialed, just as we'd encourage anybody to take training. But really, even as we look forward to the future of peer support and how it's going to be funded in Maryland, and for those that aren't familiar, the state is currently looking at making services for peers reimbursable through Medicaid in specific substance use disorder clinical settings. And that transition would require peers to become credentialed, but it's only in those specific settings. So I think it's really important that as a state leader, as Diane pointed out, our voice is being heard, that we are maintaining positions for people that are just getting into the field that aren't credentialed yet, or that may have no interest in getting credentialed, because we've heard loud and clear from whether it's one-on-one conversations I've had or large statewide listening sessions, a number of peers really just aren't interested in becoming certified peer recovery specialists because of the organic nature and the non-hierarchical nature of the peer relationship, and the fact that peer services can be delivered without a CPRS after your name. So it's a very long, convoluted answer, but in short, I think, yes, it does make it a little bit harder to get access to certain positions, but it should never be prohibitive of a peer getting into the workforce.
Okay, I'll go next. Thank you, Brendan. Brendan and I have had lots of conversations about this, as I'm sure other people on here know where I stand as far as this is concerned. I don't have anything against the credentialing, the certification part of it. I've seen, unfortunately, some people who have gotten their certification, and depending on where they've worked, it has more of a there's more of a problem with that particular organization or that environment understanding what that peer is supposed to be doing. There's pressure that can be put onto a peer as far as getting their certification. That pressure for them to get their certification is what they become focused on. You know, that's what I've seen that bothers me. They become more focused on, oh, I got to go to this training, I got to go to that training. Okay, well, are you going to those trainings because you absolutely have to, or are you going because it's something that you actually need as a skill? I mean, I've said that from the very beginning. I remember going to conferences where, you know, by the end of the day, 3:30, you go out in the lobby and you've got tons of people. And back then, before there was a credentialing, a certification process, they were usually social workers, therapists, you know, whatever, that were trying to get their CEUs. They had to wait till the end of the conference before they could get their CEUs because they weren't going to hand them out until it ended. But they're out there on their cell phones, and I don't blame them. I'm not pointing fingers. I don't blame them one bit. It sucks sometimes to sit in a area from 9 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you've got tons of emails popping up on your phone that you need to take care of. But I remember thinking, I wonder if they even want to be here, or are they just coming for their CEUs? And I would never want to be in a position where I felt like I had to stay somewhere just to get my CEUs. Because then I personally, I can't speak for everyone, of course, but I can say that then I would have to question, like, have I lost my passion to do what I have passion for? And hearing, Dan Fisher speak this morning, I was like, that's exactly how I feel about peer support. And that's exactly the kinds of things I heard in the beginning. You know, when I was hired in 2009, that's the kind of stuff we heard when we came to the conferences or when we went to trainings. It was about empowerment and it was about having passion for what we do. And unfortunately, one thing I've seen about the certification process is I have to say, sometimes I don't see that passion. And so that's scary to me to see that, you know, there could be people that are going through the trainings, getting their certification, but are they then able to keep in mind at all times that, yes, they did the hard work, they got their certification, but are they keeping in mind that they are still a peer and that they do not stand higher above the people that they are providing peer support to? And I've seen it happen in many situations. And I think just a little bit of mentoring from whoever they are working for, some guidance, that could be overcome. That's because it's easy to lose sight of those things. But that's another problem is there's organizations, agencies, places that are hiring peers, and they really don't even know why they're hiring them other than it looks good, they have to, et cetera, et cetera. They want to be able to bill for their services at some point when they're able to. So they need to be educated. Just as much as the peers need to be educated on how to do peer support, the people they're working for need to be educated. And quite frankly, having a supervisor training that doesn't really consist of a whole lot, I don't think is enough personally. I think there needs to be more education given to the entire organization, the people that are going to be working alongside of them, to let them know, hey, this is what this is about. They're not coming in here to take your job. They're not coming in here as a threat. And they're not coming in here for you to look down on them because they were at one point maybe a client who came to your facility. You need to respect them just as much. So anyway.
I agree with both of my colleagues. I think this is a one-sided self-serving conversation of what criteria somebody needs to meet in order to be a peer. If we are viewing peers as an emerging workforce, I think there are other conversations that need to be had. Just like Diane was saying, you have programs that are hiring peers and have no idea what a peer should be doing, or they have them doing really what is clinical work. You've seen that a lot of times in the job applications that are posted. So it would really, I think, behoove us as an industry to begin having those conversations like, what is an appropriate peer-to-peer caseload, even though caseload is, and so what is an appropriate salary? And can you hire peers but make them consultants or contractors and give them these outrageous caseloads because you can bill for them? The issue around clinical supervision versus non-clinical supervision or peer supervision. I think reciprocity is great. I think our certification group has done a really great job of putting some systems and checks and balances in place to take somebody along the continuum. But my thing is that eventually somebody's going to ask, how effective are peers? So where's the evidence-based practice work in this? There are true tensions between the clinical and peers. There is a real issue around peers and medication that nobody is talking about. There's a lot of bias and stigma there. So I think just, we want to figure out what a peer looks like and they meet this basic criteria, and then we turn them loose on the world. I'm not a big fan of that. I think there are other conversations that we need to be having simultaneously. I have a registered peer supervisor on my staff who's also certified, and we were having this conversation yesterday. I was telling about the conference of quality versus quantity. And I think right now we're in this quantity mode. Let's get as many people as we can certified, but we need quality peers. I supervise peers every day, and understanding that you just can't blink and be a great peer. I won't even disclose that. I'll just leave that one alone. But that's one of my big issues right there is that it needs to be about more, and hopefully the field will start talking about this. And what types of services are they looking at peers performing that you're going to be reimbursing? I know we're having this discussion now between clinical and therapeutic, but it's like, what are you going to be asking peers to do? And is the training they have or they're receiving enough to get them to do what you're asking them to do? Or are they going to need additional training? I know when we had forensic community, we developed a forensic peer. And then when we had families, we developed a family peer. Is that enough, to support the person that's pursuing a career in peer work? But more importantly, are they bringing something or value to the system?
Oh my gosh, what a rich discussion. And I think to pick up on maybe for a minute, that idea of the the certification process that we have right now allows for a lot of flexibility for peers to choose the kind of the direction that they want to go in, the skills that they need. Like it allows for folks to be reflective on what do I need to develop in terms of my knowledge or training. And especially if you're working in an environment where maybe your lived experience has been, you know, in a different system or in a different cultural context. And so you want to be more able to meet folks where they are. And at the same time, you know, we know from a recent VHA survey that the number of state-funded peer positions grew by 93% between 2017 and 2021. So the reality absolutely is that there are more and more, I appreciate what you were saying, Carlos, about kind of quantity and quality. There are more and more peer positions opening up, and working on a mobile crisis team is different than working in a wellness and recovery center, is different than working in an emergency room, is different than working in urgent care. And all of those things are also, I think, different from services navigation, right? Like if that's kind of, if the number one thing that you're doing is helping people navigate through services versus supporting someone who is dealing with a really intense situation. And along with that, questions of, and you know, I heard about what are we asking peers to do? What fits within the boundaries of peer support and what doesn't? One of the things I notice is for us to be able to articulate, and part of articulating is also measuring, right? Are we successful in doing something? Services navigation, health education, coaching, you know, facilitating support groups, providing one-on-one, like emotional CPR. Those are all different skills. And sometimes we talk about it as peers. We put a peer circle around it and say, well, whatever you're doing is probably peer support. And that is unhelpful, both for the person in that position, I think, and their, you know, whoever's their employer or supervisor and the system at large, because when there's a mismatch between what someone like wants to do, has skills, talents, knowledges, and abilities to do, and what the job is demanding, it looks like, oh, well, we never should have hired peers for this job. And that's not it at all. It's that there were very different expectations and understanding of what the job was and what it needs to be. So I think along with that, there are also a lot of benefits potentially. And Carlos, I think one of the things you're bringing up is that idea of, you know, and Diane too, it is about salaries, it is about benefits, it is about working hours. It's also about supervision and mentorship, having someone in your organization who understands what you do and who wants to help you develop as a person and as a professional. And I think a lot of that has happened very organically in the recovery movement, in the peer movement, when it is outside of sort of the treatment system, because you have to, right? You're building the bicycle while you're riding it, like you're making that happen. Whereas if you're trying to fit in or follow along with a structure, a different kind of structure that exists. So I guess if I can ask a question out, there are benefits to, you know, the explosion of peer support jobs, and there are also risks. What do you see as the benefit or the risk that you think we're not looking at enough, or we really need to be very conscious of, especially as peer support positions come more and more into the state and into treatment? So like number one risk, number one benefit. And that's open for anybody.
I'll start off. I think the number one benefit about being certified is just the increased focus on the training, the proper supervision, and the ethical responsibility that we've all been kind of talking about. Every peer brings to the table their lived experience. The training just really helps you provide support to a more diverse array of people. Personally, for me, it was also a sense of satisfaction. As a guy that runs a state directorate and only has his high school diploma, having that CPRS certificate was a really, really big deal to me. It kind of elevated me to some of my other professional peers and gave me that personal satisfaction. You said risks. I think there is a major risk, like I talked about earlier, of creating employment barriers for entry-level peers that are just not eligible to be credentialed yet. We have got to protect our fledgling workforce, as it was, the next generation of peers that are coming. We need to make sure that there are paying positions with benefits for them, not just for people that are certified. It's really important. And then looking at opportunities, I think we really need to look at requiring ongoing supervision for people that are being recertified. Much to Diane's point, we have organizations that hire peers that are certified, but once you're certified, you're not required to have a registered peer supervisor. So the organization lacks a registered peer supervisor, so nobody in the management structure knows what a peer does, how to use a peer, what a peer should be doing. And I I beg anybody at this conference today, this is a huge opportunity. We need more peer input on the peer credentialing board. If you are interested or have administrative experience, apply to be on the MAB PCB board. We have peers on there now, but we need more. The more voices around the table, the more input we get. So that's my little nutshell summary.
Even me, Brendan, you really?
You know what? I think your voice would probably be one of the most beneficial to have on there. You know, I'm a big fan of Diane, so go for it, my friend.
Well, maybe I'll do that. I'm not on any boards at the moment. So I would say that a huge benefit is the fact that peers are finally, we do have a voice. I mean, if you look at what was presented, by you guys this morning about what, Dan talked about it, and what was experienced back when in the 70s, how far we have come. It's major. It's huge. I've seen it in my lifetime, how things have expanded and grown, but we still have a ways to go. But I think having peers in the workforce and on teams definitely is a huge, huge benefit. And, I definitely don't want to be negative, because I like to focus on the positive, but I'm also a problem solver. So I see a problem, I want to try to fix it. So therefore, I do take a look at, okay, yes, they're included, they're there, they're present, but do they feel empowered to have a voice? Or do they even know what to speak about? Do they know what to fight for? Do they know the history? Is that something that's being taught in those trainings? Like the history of the mental health movement, the substance use movement, where everything started, how far it's come, and what do we need to focus on from, going forward. So I think that's something that it's a huge benefit how far we've come, but we have a ways to go, as always. And we are definitely ahead of the game when we compare ourselves to other states. The first alternatives conference, which unfortunately was the last one that was funded through SAMHSA, it was in Boston. That was the first one I ever attended, actually. So I could not believe how many other states were they had nothing compared to what we have made possible for peers and for the consumer movement, the peer movement, whatever we're calling it this decade. That's something that we have that not everybody else does. So, that's a huge blessing for our state. But as far as the risk, I really, really think that one thing that really, really concerns me that I've seen as well is people are allowed to get their certification even when they've I think 2 years is not enough. 2 years in recovery. I know some really great people that have only had 2 years and do have a job and do awesome. So I am not, it's just, I have seen plenty of people get into this, even just the training, and haven't even gotten the job yet, and they get overwhelmed because they're still working on themselves. They're still working hard on their own recovery. So I think maybe even, I'm not saying we need to put a timeline on it, but to have the person that is actually getting trained to really, okay, take a self-assessment tool. Are you ready for this kind of work? Are you ready to get back out there and be around people that are doing things that you're trying to pull away from? That might be too uncomfortable for you, especially in that substance use community of, Are you able to be around somebody that's going through detox? That's going to bring back some really bad memories for you. Are you ready to be on the same street that you were on buying drugs? I mean, I've heard a lot of stories from people. I've seen a lot of things. And it breaks my heart to see when somebody literally gets into this, they want to try, they want to do it. Because I've given supervision to a lot of people that that are not employed here at our center. But for a while, I was one of the only supervisors in the area. So people would send me, like, hey, can this person get supervision from you? And I'm like, sure. So I've seen a lot of people just kind of fall through the cracks because they weren't ready. And so does there need to be a component to, can we really have an honest, open conversation and say, are you ready for this? And I know people need jobs. I know they want jobs. They have that passion, especially early on. Let's face it. We all have a lot more passion when we were able to be successful in our own life, and we want to spread that onto other people. But there might need to be something that we need to take a look at, just to make sure that people don't fall back into something where they're overwhelmed and they turn to something that is not well. And that can happen just as well with if you're overcoming depression, if you're overcoming something more from the mental health perspective. I've seen it happen, and it's sad, and it's very hard for supervisors. I can say myself, it's very difficult to provide supervision to someone who might not be ready. Maybe you think they're ready, but once they get out there, once they're doing it, they may not be ready. And then that makes it difficult for that person and the supervisor. And, so anyway, that's just something. I'll be quiet now. Carlos, it's all yours.
This is one of those kind of things where we could probably spend the next hour talking. There is no doubt that there are benefits to having registered peer supervisors or certified peer supervisors. And I think along the context of years ago, we used to always talk about the continuum of care: prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery. But there really was not a recovery arm. It was sort of like recovery was an appendage of treatment. All right. But I think peers have like dispelled that and just sort of like laid the groundwork, if you will, for the recovery continuum. I was in treatment in '89.
Okay, that's good.
And one of the things was not only did they have groups for my mother to talk about codependence and other stuff, we also had aftercare. And then mysteriously, miraculously, aftercare went away. And I understand why. And so treatment became the end all, so to speak. If you go to treatment, you come out of there, here's a schedule, touch on your head, never to use again. We'll see you when you get back. And what's happened is I was actually working at BSAS when we were first approached about funding peers in emergency rooms. And so I think that's where we began, or the system began to see values in this peer-to-peer interaction. And I think what's happened now, the system, the macro system itself, sees values in peers, but only in the sense that it serves the purposes of the macro system, not that it benefits the person that maybe completes treatment and is trying to initiate their recovery and to sustain their recovery. And it's not going to be enough just to fund a boatload of peers. You've also got to fund services, wraparound services, housing, and some other things. And I think the system is beginning to realize that. So if we do it comprehensively, I think peers are going to be a good thing. I think we're going to get our lumps in that there's just going to be a lot of programs that are going to use peers up. I think we could fall into the same category they did with counselor trainees. They served a purpose to meet a deficit in the workforce. If nobody, and I see you gritting your teeth a little bit, Katie, but if we can't be honest about this, I'm being, if we can't be honest about this, it's a great opportunity for our folks. They bring an awful lot to the table, but they are not the panacea for what ails this system, And if nothing else, I'm going to continue to be an advocate that recovery in and of itself has the ability to be a macro system if you're willing to resource it and support it to the degree and level that it needs to be. So as an advocate activist, needless to say, I'm disappointed that Congress did not vote for the 10% set aside for recovery dollars. But that doesn't mean that the state can't do it just because Congress didn't do it. So big A advocacy, little a advocacy, we need to continue to push Congress to do the set aside, and we need to push the state. We did the same thing with trying to advocate for the alcohol tax. And I'll end with this. We fought 10 years for an alcohol tax. I was executive director for NCADD Maryland, made the decision that we needed to be at the same table with the developmentally disabled community and the mental health community, but even we weren't strong enough to push that thing over the finish line. It took a coalition of the willing where we got an increase in the alcohol tax, and then treatment got disappointed. So we passed the tax, DDA got money to reduce their waiting list, mental health got their 2% cut restored, and treatment was told to come back next year. But did we give up? No, we went back next year and we got like $7.6 million earmarked for recovery. So, it's one thing to train all these peers and everything, but let us not peer community forget about the role of advocacy. All right. What did they say? Nothing about us without us. And one of the things that I'll end with this is I found is that the tendency or the reluctance, Brendan, of peers to really do big A advocacy, but little a advocacy when you're more concerned about protecting your job. So we need to figure out how, as peers, we can continue to do this, but not put our employment in jeopardy. We recover and we vote.
Oh, I love that. And I appreciate, yes, that it's especially, I think about Honor of Maryland and the history of Honor of Maryland, of being able to convene conversations for us to talk about in a very real way, what are the challenges and the opportunities? How are we working together on the micro level, right? Like person to person, about empowerment, about advocacy, about rights, to talk, to echo what Dan was talking about this morning. And then at the sort of the meso level of, programs, peer run programs, peers in management positions, peers on advisory boards, peers on local, at the local level or the regional level, having significant impact on how systems are created, are funded, are sustained, are organized. I know Maryland right now is putting a lot of energy into rethinking crisis services. There's these 3 HSCRC projects, which folks may have heard of, about GBRICS in the greater Baltimore region, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Carroll and Howard, then also down in Prince George's and in the lower shore Tri-County area, that there's these, multi-million-dollar planning grants that are convening folks to rethink crisis services and how, with mobile crisis teams or mobile response teams, with peer support specialists, with urgent care facilities, from the national level coming in for folks who maybe weren't at our 988 symposium back in March. But starting in July, everybody across the country can call 988 instead of 911 if you're having a behavioral health emergency, and get tapped into the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network. And there's a lot of conversations about, when folks are calling for support in emotional distress, whether it be mental health or substance use or trauma or, whatever is going on. How are people getting support? Who is responding? And how do we make that be peers? Like go to a urgent care where you can get some peer support, go to a wellness and recovery center, have a mobile response team come out with peer support for you to avoid law enforcement, to avoid hospitalization, to avoid waiting, for weeks for an appointment when you're in distress right now. So there are spaces in all of those places on those local, planning efforts for peer voice. And now is the time, because this is when decisions are getting made. This is when funding is being structured. So if you're not involved, like with your local planning board or advisory committee or you want to get more involved, please do contact us at Voices at Honor of Maryland. Like, a big part of what we want to do is make sure that people are connected with those advocacy opportunities. But I wanted to, something that I think all three of you have touched on that I want to pull in, speaking of, tough topics. Let's talk for a minute about burnout and trauma and that question of, readiness is always I think a tough word, because I also want to respect, and I think it's so crucial that people are in recovery when you say you're in recovery. You know what I mean? That looks different for everyone, that there's many pathways, that harm reduction is important, and that we all have, we're all negotiating so much in our lives. Some things may be internal, some things may be external. The pandemic is just a great old big example of how things you never predicted suddenly change, like everything in your life. So I want to center that into, we mentioned this, the idea of sort of like someone having experience, feeling personally strong in their recovery, and how important that is for your own wellness, especially if you are working in a situation where you're going to be working with folks who are experiencing intensity. And if that's triggering, and how do you practice self-care? So I think there's that level. And then there's also, are you working for an organization where you literally have access to health insurance to help cover, different types of support that you may want, where you can have time off, where you can have an honest conversation with your supervisor about if you're struggling. So I want to open that up to talk about burnout, this idea of, of how do folks, this is true for anyone, right? It's not just true for peers, like anybody right now working in any sort of behavioral health situation or being part of it, we're all navigating trauma, and we never know what someone else has been going through. But I think that question of when things are not okay, and you are a certified peer support specialist or working as a peer support specialist, what do you do when things aren't okay? If we want to use the word relapse or symptoms or, having an episode or whatever language you want, how do we navigate the fact that happens for all of us as people, and what that means in a professional context? And since you've all been, on the ground working with folks, managers, consulting on policy issues, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that question. If that made sense as a question. I realize I rambled a bit there. Okay.
Yeah, so that made sense to me. And I think a lot of it comes down to the little A advocacy that Carlos was talking about, and being proactive in that advocacy. So I know one of the things that I was very fortunate early on in my peer career, my peer job, was I worked for a health department that really had strong recovery values. And one of the things they made sure is that when they hired a peer, they informed them about the employee assistance program. They informed us that there was a registered peer supervisor on staff that was not only trained in the 6-hour course that Diane rightfully discounted a little bit, but they also had a background in recovery themselves, and they were able to kind of talk the talk and walk the walk, and really just got me as an individual acclimated with the organization that I was going in. But alternatively, if you are not a peer in an organization that has all of that gifted to you, because it really was a gift early on in my recovery, advocate for yourself, get to know your organizational policies. So that way, if you do go into crisis, kind of like in a RAP plan, you've got something spelled out already on how you want to respond, or how you want your supporters to respond in that event. And alternatively, I think the most important thing for me, whether it was in a professional sense or just in my everyday life, is having an external accountability partner. Like, I've got somebody that when things start to go bad or things start to go wrong in my life, that I can talk to and bounce ideas off of. So I'm getting a non-biased, non-in-here idea. And then that person can also give me some guidance, peer support, on how to handle that situation, whether it's revealing to a employer that I've had a lapse, or I'm having concerns about maybe having a lapse, or whatever the case may be. So again, advocating for myself, putting a plan in place while I'm well and while I'm feeling good, all of these things that we learn in different trainings that we go to, but just really applying them not only to my personal recovery, but my professional recovery in life as well. Good question.
So some of the work that we did when we were looking at the peer certification had to revolve around if you had a reoccurrence of your diagnosis, how would that impact or affect your certification? Some heated debates. The general feeling was if you came from a mental health perspective and you had an incident, that you would be encouraged to go to treat it or to deal with it, and then come back and pick up your peer work right where you left off. But if your background and your diagnosis was in substance abuse, then the general feeling was you need to be penalized. You need to either lose your certification altogether or penalized enough that you had to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to get it back. So I'm probably sure there's still two schools of thought on that. I do remember also at one time, peers were pushing real hard for peer support groups. Think along the lines of impaired professionals. So impaired professionals like dentists and doctors, they have their support groups. They don't advertise and you don't know where they're at. You just have to be one of those professionals to know. So creating a group that's a safe environment. Also, it could be an EAP for peers. I'm not sure. I do think also, Brendan, that the system should allow money in a budget for organizations to do centering and self-care activities and events. In other words, I'm a peer, I'm going through something, I can apply to my job, I can get $250 if I go on a retreat or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Something to encourage you to do self-care. Because my experience is peers they hit the ground running and they run hard. And they don't know anything else but to run hard. And sometimes it's because they're running from themselves and not taking a look at themselves and doing work. So they focus on who they're helping. All right. So sometimes they need to be reminded, but peers are usually the last ones that want to take care of themselves. That's my experience of having supervised peers for years. And so I have to be insistent on it. So I think it's also going to be up to the supervisor to write, because usually what happens when a peer is going down the rabbit hole, their behavior, it's exhibited in their behavior before anything else. And so it's just going to take a good supervisor to recognize that and to encourage the person to, you might want to take some time to take care of yourself.
Solution oriented. I like that. Diane, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, I have experienced burnout. And one thing that I can say that I think is crucial in every organization, no matter where you are or what role you play, is that we're all here to support one another. So, setting up an environment where you feel comfortable and safe going to someone and talking about your problems and talking about whatever it is going on, and not to be penalized for it necessarily. Because the one thing about all of us as humans, and the one thing that I love about peer support, is that we approach things from a unique perspective. So I can put all kinds of guidelines and policies and things in place, but when it comes down to it, we still do need to look at each other from a unique perspective. And so being able to look at someone, whether you're looking at yourself and trying to figure out if you're in a place where you do need to take a break, you need to ask for time off, you need to seek help, or you're the one that's providing that to someone else, as a mentor, as a supervisor, you need to look at it as a unique situation. It's not always easy to do, because then, especially when you're a leader and you're managing, several employees, you certainly don't want one employee to say, well, why did you do that for them and you didn't do it for me? And I've been in that situation, I understand. So, but still keeping in mind that we are all unique individuals, and that at the end of the day, we are all peers, and we've all been down really, really, really low. And that if we're able to help other people see and, see hope and empower them, then we need to be able to do that for ourselves. We need to recognize it in each other and be able to do it for one another. There have been groups set up for peers. There have been groups, whether it's been in person, online, on Facebook, email, and they've been for supervisors, they've been for peers, but and sometimes it's worked great and other times it just kind of fizzles out. And that's how things happen, unfortunately, in this world. And I think COVID really put, that just sent everything that we were trying to create at one point, we're going to have to recreate a lot of things. And we are able to do that, which we're doing that now. But I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just think that just keeping in mind that we all need to make sure that we know who we are. And if we steer away from it, that we have a support system. We tell people to build up your network of support. Make sure you have a sponsor. Make sure you have someone that you can go to about other things. If it's somebody you can't go to, I don't know about sponsors necessarily, if you should be able to go to them about absolutely anything. But I know myself, there's certain people I don't go to about certain things because they're going to judge me about those particular things. I'll go to other people about those things because they get it. They understand. They're not going to judge me. But like I've always said, if I were to get diagnosed with breast cancer, I would go to my friend who had it and overcame it and is still alive and is surviving and doing well. I probably would go to her before I call my mother, because she gets it. She completely gets it. She understands. So I think that's kind of the way we need to look at a lot of things we deal with in life is going to somebody that can understand and empathize. And if that person doesn't, then that person should be, strong enough to say, let's go find somebody that can understand. And I'd like to say COVID has taught me that that the world will not stop spinning if I am not present at every moment for every meeting and every single thing that we feel like we are supposed to do. So that is one thing I learned from COVID that has been a huge blessing, because I used to think that the world would end, not literally, but that things would come crashing down if I didn't go to every single meeting and do every single thing. And if that meant working 12 hours a day, then I would do it. And that's not the way to live. And so that's one thing I've definitely been able to get from COVID. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's just my take on things. So, thank you.
Thank you. I think what I feel coming through is, and I hope folks are kind of following along in the chat. There's a lot of great questions there, and comments and resources. One of the things that I think Carlos also echoes something that you were talking about earlier is about the importance of having a job description that's accurate in terms of, I'm a peer support specialist. These are the boundaries and ethics, that my boundaries and ethics are different than somebody who maybe is a health coach or a health educator or a community health worker or a therapist or a social worker. Like that what peer support does is special and unique, and that the respect for those boundaries is something that's so important to everyone. It's important to the organization not to put inappropriate expectations on. It's important for the person in the role to be able to, like you were saying, for those of us who maybe find a lot of support and structure and recovery and work, to not burn ourselves out by running if we don't have boundaries, healthy boundaries that are all about, in the microcosm of each of us, really practicing the same sort of peer support, compassion, balance that we try to hold with other people. I realize we are at time, and yes, we could talk about this, many more things. So I want to open up to maybe kind of first, if there are other questions in the chat, folks, please feel free to throw them in there. But I also think if each of you could say, either final thoughts, something you wanted to make sure that you said today that we haven't touched on yet, now's the time. But also, briefly, like, what's your hope for the future of the professionalization of peer support? It has happened. It is happening. It's gonna keep coming. Gosh knows there is, like we talked about, funding is coming through. Everyone is saying, well, let's just put peers everywhere. And yes, peers should be everywhere. You know what I mean? And peers should have jobs that don't necessarily have the word peer in the title. Like, people with lived experience should be in every level of the system, guiding, driving, shaping the future. But I do want to give each of you just the space to voice, your hopes or your thoughtful advisories about the future of the professionalization of peer support. Who wants to start?
I'm not bashful and I'm not shy, just in case you didn't notice. If I had to say one thing, is that my prayer, my hope is that the peer community finds its voice and is willing to step up and to speak truth to power. Otherwise, we're going to get just what they want to give us and no more. Faces and Voices talks about 10% of a jurisdiction's population is in some level or some form of recovery. So that to me says is that we have a pretty large recovery community in Maryland, but I don't see it and I don't hear their voice. And so if we're not willing to speak up for ourselves and to advocate for ourselves, we got nothing coming.
I'm actually going to jump on Carlos's bandwagon, but with a little bit different flavor. I think, as has been described over the conference today, the peer workforce, especially in Maryland, is growing at a rapid rate. It's extremely strong, and we're getting into all these new areas where peers haven't been seen before. But what we need now more than ever is our next generation of peer leadership. And whether that is being a voice as an advocate, being a voice as a trainer, we need peer trainers so bad right now, or being the next generation of administrators and directors and system policy influencers. If you have an interest, if you were that kid who used to like to be the center of attention, apply to be a trainer. It's a really fun gig. Like, if there's one thing I miss about my current role now, it's I don't get to train as much anymore. But become involved in the community of peers. We're growing, but we need your support. So I think really what Carlos said kind of hit the nail on the head for me.
I'm just going to say that I just hope that the professionalism of peer support continues to grow and that we all continue to learn what it is and the best way to approach it. We cannot jump into things and hope that it's going to work out well. We really need to take a solid look at, let's make this work. Let's make this work for us. Let's make it work for those future generations. Let's learn from our mistakes and let's do it, not just sit around and have a bunch of meetings and talk about it and then do the same thing 2 months later and the same thing over and over and over again. Let's do it. So that means we need to find the people that can do it and are willing to do it and make it happen. So that's my hope for the future of peer support, is that we can make it happen. We can grow and be much stronger as time goes on, as we have seen before. We have seen it happen. We know it can happen. So we want to continue to make it happen. So thank you.
Oh my goodness. It really, Diane, Carlos, Brendan, thank you so much for being a part of this panel. I know the chat was popping off. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but I really just want to thank each of you for your leadership, your thoughtfulness, your good humor, and your honesty and transparency. I remember something that that Bunky said in our earlier panel, kind of thinking about leadership, but the idea that this is a moment where we have such diversity in the peer movement, and that's our strength, right? Like, our strength is our ability to have different lived experiences, to come together, to see each other fully, to appreciate, every piece of the 360 perspective, and so often to find solutions that no one else thought of, right? To not be stuck in the paradigms that we were handed or the structures that currently exist, but to pioneer an entirely new way of thinking about this. And the gift, I think, from the professionalization of peer support, not just from peer support, but from the professionalization, is that we are speaking about what every human being goes through as we try to balance being a person and a professional, right? Being a whole person with all of our with all of our parts and pieces and journeys and histories and traumas and skills and knowledge and all of that. And at some level, all professional roles are about, drawing boundaries or fitting into a box or completing something. And so we're all balancing a very organic, fluid, non-linear experience with, because of the society that we live in, a very structured, like product-oriented, outcome-oriented system. And I believe so strongly, though, that there's a way through. There's a way that peers can prove our effectiveness in a way that doesn't corrupt our values. There's a way that we can use resources that are available to fuel innovation and to reform the system. So I appreciate each of you in your call to advocacy, that we have a lot of deep thinking and a lot of deep conversations to do. And as someone who's been in this role at Honor of Maryland for just about a year and a half, I just want to say thank you. We are extraordinarily lucky to have such incredible long-term leaders, dedicated mentors who are willing to come and to share, to heighten all of our awareness of how big this world is, and that it comes down to just who we are as people. Diane, calling back to something you said at the beginning, to being there, right, one-on-one with each other, and seeing each other as people. So I want to just thank you. Can we get a big round of applause on your camera, on your emojis, in the chat?
Our mission is transformation. Through mental health or substance use challenges, we found our voice. With 30 years of experience in peer-run alternatives, person-centered training, and systems-level advocacy, we empower agents of change, lifting up leaders with lived experience to shape the future of healthcare. We are On Our Own of Maryland.